where do you draw the line? When you start saying this part of the biblical text is true, but this part is not, how do you make that determination?
What you've just described is exactly how progressive Christians approach the Bible. I've read quotes to my audience before, they've heard all this, but progressive Christians will say, what we read in the Old Testament is not necessarily God's breathed out word through prophets, but really it's a group of people that were living in a certain context, and they were just doing their best to understand God in the times and places in which they lived. But when they describe God commanding Israel to go in and wipe out the Canaanites, God wouldn't do something like that because we've evolved, right? This whole evolution of religion idea. And we know now, we know better. We have more access to knowledge about God. So we can look back on that. And we can certainly value it. We can hold it in high regard. But ultimately what we're looking at is a group of people that were just communing with God in their time and place. They were doing their best to figure him out, but they were probably looking around to their pagan neighbors and, for example, seeing that, if they won a battle, that was honoring to their God to win that battle. And so Israel was just doing the same kind of thing. How might you interact if somebody were to say something like that to you? Because I know the Old Testament is important to you.
Yeah, so I would definitely push back on that idea because I think that the foundational question I would ask is, well, what do you believe about God? If God is real and personal and interactive, then I think it is almost blasphemous to his character to say that he cannot accurately represent himself to a people group. Like, if we believe that we have an accurate view of him now, even through Christ, like, let's just take the Old Testament out, because I would imagine most of your viewers would acknowledge that they think in Christ, at least, we have God accurately conveying himself. Well, why can he not then do it for the thousands of years before that? What is so privileged at that point that God would allow himself to be inaccurately understood prior to that, and only at this point be accurately understood? And it also makes me wonder, like, where do you draw the line? When you start saying this part of the biblical text is true, but this part is not, how do you make that determination? How do you say that we understand Christian or God to be of this kind of character, but not of this kind of character? Then, in more often than not, we're then reflecting what we think his character should be rather than what the text says. And the interesting thing about it is, if you actually go and you look at the text in its own right and you let it be what it is instead of trying to kind of push what you think it should be on it, you actually see the same God in both covenants. Like, the beauty of what God did with Israel, we look at it and we think it was horrifying to the Canaanites. We think, oh my gosh, that's terrible. But actually, Clay Jones, who was a professor of mine in Biola, he says, that's because we identify with the Canaanites rather than the Israelites.
Yeah.
And if you look at the Old Testament laws, which we, looking back, think are really archaic and cruel, if you look at them in their own context and compare them to the ancient Near East, God was actually protecting people. Like, the ancient Near East, or the Israelite laws were actually kind and loving and protected all of these people groups that the ancient Near Eastern cultures around them just completely abused. So the idea of an eye for an eye, which seems archaic to us, was execution for an eye. That then the Israelites were like, no, let's have equal punishment.
That's right.
For
the punishment can't exceed the crime.
Right.
Essentially. Yeah.
Right. And so I think that when you look at the Old Testament in light of its culture, and I think that's part of the problem, is we're looking back on it from 21st century culture and judging it. But if we look at it in light of its culture, it actually shows how amazing God is, how much he loved Israel, so much so that he was saying, these other peoples in this area, I have given them, it talks about in the Exodus, that the fullness of the Canaanite sin comes to pass. So God is even gracious with the Canaanites. He allows them an additional 400 years to get as corrupt as they want or turn to him. And at that point, he says they've all sinned to this point where they need judgment. And it's going to be difficult and dangerous for you guys to move into this area if I leave them. And so it's a gracious thing on the Israelites for God to be able to move into this place in a militarial way. But it's also, I think sometimes people push back because they are afraid that would then mean that God today could tell us to go into a holy war.
Right.
But I think that the pushback on that is they lived in a theocracy. God was their king, and it was set up explicitly like that coming out of Egypt. But that is not the kind of government that we see post-Israel. Like in the exiles, or post the kingdoms period. So the exiles, they go off and they're under different religious, different governmental rules. We see that with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, then the Greeks, the Romans, and then what we know of the rest of Western history. And so there's never been a government structure like there was at the period of the conquest. And I don't know that there's any reason to argue that God would ever try and do that again, because he was trying to do something very specific with Israel during that period. Yeah. He was trying to show what it meant to be in relationship with God, what it meant to be holy, and the distinction that we have between that we are not and he is. And I think he's conveyed that message, so I don't see any reason why he would expect that same kind of relationship or governmental structure to ever surface again prior to whatever he decides he's going to do through Revelation at the end times.